variety of environmental challenges. So I really want to talk about three things today, and I know you guys are really interested in the last one, but I want to start by talking a little bit about kind of what some of the universal challenges are with urban forestry that I'm sure many of you are encountering and we've encountered as well. How data-driven decision-making can be leveraged, especially in the law and policy context for urban forestry, and then really turning to that law and policy piece and thinking about some of the interventions, particularly tree protection ordinances. I also want to set the stage by kind of just naming three trends that I think most of you are probably aware of. But one is that, tree canopy coverage across the United States, not just in this region, is declining and has been declining for some time. We also know that tree canopy coverage across the US is not equal. In many of our major metropolitan areas, more robust tree canopy coverage, it tends to correlate with areas that are wealthier, and the reverse is true for lower income areas. And then, all of these things are kind of coming together in a number of ways, in addition to tending to see lower income areas and areas with high concentrations of minority populations have sparser tree canopy coverage. We're also seeing that correlate with urban heat island effect, which isn't surprising, right? If you've got less trees, more impervious surface, it's going to be hotter. But we're starting to think about what that's going to look like long-term in 2030 or 2050 if we continue to see the decline of urban forests across the country and an increase in extreme heat due to climate change. What is that going to mean for our cities and towns, and what does that look like? So as David said, I'm going to draw a lot today in my talk on my experience working on a consultant team for the city of Cambridge on their urban forest master plan. This was a project that the city undertook several years ago now, before COVID. It ended up being a multi-year effort that was really focused in the front end on collecting a lot of data and trying to understand what the challenges were in Cambridge before we pivoted to talking about potential interventions and solutions. And I am going to set the stage a little bit by talking about some of the data that we did and some of the findings we had, because I think it ended up being extremely instrumental in our policy recommendations at the end of the project. And I think that it made our recommended solutions, not only gave them a lot of credibility, but really set us up in a spot where we really thought that they would be effective and think that they will be effective. So here's the context in Cambridge. Over about a nearly 10-year period, we saw a pretty significant decline in Cambridge's urban canopy coverage, going from about 30% coverage in 2009 to just 26% coverage in 2018. We also were able to determine that the majority of that loss was happening on residential properties, about 119 acres over that same period. And I'm going to come back to that later because that ends up being pretty important when we start shifting to the law and policy context. So we did a lot of data collection, and I'm not going to talk about all of it. There's a really robust report that we ended up putting out for the city, and it's got all of that data collection in there. But here are just some of the kind of key things that we really focused in on. So looking at the annual rate of tree canopy loss, like I described in the last slide, but also tree loss by location and land use, tree species across the city, the condition of trees. And then what was really great is we were able to model the future. So looking at projected annual loss by species out to 2030, 2050, 2070, taking into consideration how species might be susceptible to pests and diseases, how that might increase their loss rate, and also how future flood and drought projections might increase that loss rate. And shout out to Applied Ecological Services and Kleinfelder, who were consultants on the team and did a lot of this data work for us. And so from all of that data collection, again, we found out a lot, but these are some of the kind of high level data findings that ended up being important for us when we started talking about policy. So one, we figured out that, if the current trajectory of Cambridge's urban forest decline continued unmitigated, we would be looking at pretty significant decline out to 2030 and 2050, potentially only 15% canopy coverage by 2050. And that took into consideration at the time Cambridge's replanting rate, which was about 400 trees a year. We also found out that there were just 3 species that comprised 33% of Cambridge's canopy. And those were the Norway maple, honey locust, and pin oak. And obviously a catastrophic loss of those 3 species would have a really dramatic effect on the city's canopy coverage. We also were able to determine that there really was no single overwhelming cause of canopy loss. And this ended up being important because there was really an anecdotal feeling in the city among residents, even among elected officials, that the majority of the canopy decline was caused by redevelopment. You know, Cambridge, like many other cities in the Northeast, was undergoing a lot of redevelopment, pretty big development boom in some neighborhoods. And the anecdotal feeling was that is what was causing the decline, that a lot of trees were being removed through the construction process. And that actually ended up not being true. There were obviously, a significant portion of trees that were being removed through that process, but there was actually even more trees being removed on residential properties outside of the development context. And so that ended up being really important for us to know later when we were thinking about potential solutions. We determined that the majority of trees were in good condition, so that was great. And that the largest proportion of the city's canopy, as I said, was on private residential property, about 39%, with only 22% falling in the public right of way. So again, that, kind of gave us some hints about, what interventions were going to be effective. We actually determined that even if we somehow managed to plant every inch of suitable planting area owned by the city, we still would not meet our canopy coverage goals. So early on, we knew part of the solution has to be private property, whether that's institutional properties, residential properties. We cannot meet our tree canopy coverage goals if we're relying on publicly owned property alone, especially public right-of-ways. And then 29% of the canopy being susceptible to pests and droughts and flood factors. That goes back to what I said in the last slide about kind of projecting out what that loss could be and wanting to curb that over the long term. And then finally, as I mentioned before, Cambridge is not unique in that, like many other major metropolitan areas, its urban forest is not distributed evenly across neighborhoods. And we tended to see more robust tree canopy coverage in the more affluent areas of the city, in the reverse being true in more low income areas. And then these are just some charts from the report looking at the gain and loss by land use over that nearly 10-year period between 2009 and 2018. And then again, that a chart of kind of the percentage of canopy in each of those categories, as well as this chart on the bottom here, which shows you a little bit of that projection modeling that we did to look at, conservative and an accelerated loss scenario, what kind of drought and flood conditions might do to the canopy coverage out to 2070. So switching gears to kind of the law and policy piece, the first thing that we really wanted to do was understand the existing framework in Cambridge, which I think is important in any city that you're working in when you're starting to think about either new or expanded policies for tree protection. And so in Massachusetts, we've got a state law called the Public Shade Tree Law, which applies to trees in the public right of way. And it essentially just creates a process for tree removal and to some extent discourages the removal of healthy trees, if only by, creating a process that really slows things down. In addition to that, many cities and towns in Massachusetts, Cambridge included, have city tree protection ordinances. Not every place has that, so it was great to be working in Cambridge where they had a starting point. They already had one in place. But the existing canopy or the existing tree protection ordinance in the city at the time that we started this project really only applied to public property and actually was primarily focused on properties in the redevelopment context. So if you were redeveloping a property and you were going through the city's development review process, most of the tree protection ordinance requirements applied to those projects and not kind of outside of that context. And then city zoning requirements. So I think this is pretty common too, where even in places where they have tree protection ordinances, there's also a number of tree related requirements kind of baked into zoning or design review in the city. And that was true in Cambridge as well, primarily around requirements of tree plans and tree mitigation baked into kind of the landscaping requirements for new development. But again, very focused on new development and not, and that's just kind of one subset of properties that we were interested in. So as we started to think about, what we might be able to do, whether we might be able to expand the tree protection ordinance or look at other policy solutions, we tried very hard to kind of think through the unintended consequences of some of those decisions and really weigh the pros and cons. And we were ultimately faced with a lot of competing priorities, which I think is true in most places, especially in cities that are very dense and you're competing for land. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody's competing for the same space, whether that's trees, housing, bike lanes, like everybody's competing for that same space. And we were seeing a lot of tension between those trade-offs and those uses. And so trying to think through, what those trade-offs were and what some of the unintended consequences might be of kind of not thinking that through ahead of time. But then also kind of the run-of-the-mill, tensions about if we increase the jurisdiction of the city's protection ordinance, or if we enhance maintenance and enforcement requirements, that's going to cost the city in terms of increased staff and overhead costs. And so there's trade-offs there too. So what we did is we actually looked at a number of policy solutions. I'm going to focus on tree protection ordinances because I know that's something that you all are interested in. And that was kind of one piece of our recommendations for the city. But in order to really make our recommendations, we did do a national scan to just kind of look at best practices across the country. What were other cities and towns doing? How did kind of what they were doing differ? And I'll say one of the main takeaways from this process was that there really is no one size fits all. There is not a template for how to do this. Every city is a little bit different, and it has to be because it has to be responding to the unique challenges in that individual city or town. But it was helpful to understand kind of where there was a lot of overlap or where there was a lot of consistency across different ordinances, or where there was a difference and why there was a difference. And these are some of the kind of key aspects of most of the tree protection ordinances that we looked at. The main one being jurisdiction. It's either covering public property, private property, or something in between, like Cambridge, where it applied to private property, but only in the development context. I will say a lot of tree protection ordinances do not cover private property outside of the redevelopment context. I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in that, but to date, most of them have not focused on that. And I think for a lot of obvious reasons, it's pretty controversial to pass an ordinance like this and infringe on what a lot of people would think of as an infringement on private property rights. We also looked at the size of trees being protected. So normally a tree protection ordinance at a baseline sets out a definition of the types of trees that it is intended to protect. And that's usually based on a DBH number. So we for the most part, there was a range of about 6 inches to 12 inches DBH for kind of the minimum protection. There were some outliers. Some had much higher DBH, like up to 36 inches DBH, but the majority kind of fell in the 6 to 12 range. Cambridge at the time was 8, and I'll talk a little bit about why we recommended that they lower it. But it was helpful to kind of see the range of minimum DBH size in the different ordinances. And then special tree protection. So in addition to kind of the broad sweeping requirements for this kind of minimum tree size, some places also have a separate category for the largest and oldest trees, trying, in an effort to recognize the fact that these trees bring a very unique and kind of invaluable set of ecological services that cannot easily be replaced and that they deserve extra protection. They're called different things depending on where you are. Some people call them heritage trees, special trees, exceptional trees, and they're obviously much larger. So we've seen anywhere from between like 36 to 100 inches DBH as kind of the minimum protection level. And then mitigation requirements, which obviously is the teeth of a protection ordinance. Many of the ordinances create a permit process for removal. That's kind of the mechanism that they do enforcement with. So if you want to remove a tree, you've got to go to the city, you've got to get a tree removal permit, and then you would be subject to all of these requirements. This really, enforcement and mitigation really are all, there's a huge range in terms of how strict or how lenient enforcement is. There are a handful of places that are really strict about this, and you cannot remove a tree unless it is diseased or dying. You cannot remove a healthy tree. Other places are much more lenient. There's an appeals process, there's waiver processes. Some places just make you get a permit and they just make you write down why you want to remove it. And they don't do any kind of checking to see whether there's an alternative or whether, you should be able to remove a perfectly healthy tree. Mitigation requirements, again, really depending on what the jurisdiction is. Like if you're applying mitigation requirements in a development context, you're baking that into the developer's kind of, construction requirements. If you're doing it for private property outside of the development context, it's a little bit trickier. And then we also looked at alternatives to I put alternatives to tree protection ordinances here, but that's not really true because some places have both. But there is, I think we're seeing a little bit of a trend towards incorporating more comprehensive landscape requirements into zoning and recognizing that although we do want to promote tree planting and we want to curb loss, there are some places, again, with this trade-off with just space where it's maybe not going to be possible to plant a bunch of new trees. And so what would a good alternative be? And you see this in Seattle and DC with the green factor and green area ratio systems. That's starting to, I think, be exported elsewhere and kind of tweaked into some system where you say, okay, these are all of the things that are beneficial, different types of landscaping techniques, including trees, and this is the point system that we're going to assign. I think, in systems like that, it's great if trees can have a really high point count, because then you can incentivize tree planting where it is feasible, but you're also giving people the flexibility of an alternative if it really isn't feasible. And so, like I said, we did a pretty wide scan. This is just a couple of snapshots of the charts that we put together to summarize kind of what we were seeing and what was kind of most common. This is on specifically requirements for removal or destruction. So actually in this chart, you can see a lot of these cities did have jurisdiction on private property outside of the development process, which was interesting. A lot of them also had exemptions for removals that other than dead or hazardous. So like I said, there's kind of a range of leniency there. And a lot of places do have some type of waiver or appeal process that, you're not limited to just removing dead or diseased trees. You might be able to remove them for some other reason. Many of them had special or heightened requirements for those big, large trees that we want to protect. And then on the planning side, it was interesting, a lot of them have tree protection ordinances that are not backed up by something like a UFMP or a broader citywide policy for canopy coverage. So it's interesting. I think a lot of those are kind of older tree protection ordinances that have been in place for a long time. As I mentioned, a lot of them, also have kind of these zoning landscape and design standards for tree protection. Some of them have commissions, board councils, things like that. And then we looked at, as an enforcement mechanism, whether or not somebody was kind of checking up to see if you had complied with the ordinance before they issued your certificate of occupancy, which was something we were interested in for Cambridge, and that was less common. And then in terms of mitigation, again, we just kind of looked across the board to see what others were doing. This really ranged, some tree protection ordinances were short and really focused on tree removal. Others were, a little bit more holistic in looking at not just removal requirements, but maybe some pruning requirements, pruning standards, prohibiting excessive pruning, requiring a permit for pruning. So kind of expanding just beyond tree removal to tree care, essentially, in some of these ordinances. And some of them actually even requiring performance guarantees or bonds for maintenance, and which is not uncommon. You see that sometimes, especially tree protection ordinances applying during the development context, or even just in zoning requirements in places that don't have tree protection ordinances, where there's some type of a bond required for a number of years of maintenance after the project is complete, usually 2 years or something like that. And then another big piece of this was tree funds. So a lot of places that do require some type of an in lieu payment, either as an alternative to replanting or just kind of outright. It's got to live somewhere. So a lot of tree protection ordinances will kind of simultaneously set up some type of tree replacement fund, which is intended to be, well, it can be used for a lot of things, but it's kind of intended to be used to mitigate the loss of trees. Oh, I'm gonna go back for a second. So in Cambridge, what we ended up recommending for the city of Cambridge were a couple of things. One, we recommended that they expand the jurisdiction of the existing tree protection ordinance to include private properties outside of the development context. And I want to go back to something I said earlier, which is the data collection that we did early on was really critical to the recommendations that we ended up making, because if we had not done that data to look at where tree loss was actually happening and why, and we had just kind of gone off of the anecdotal experience that like, oh, it's got to be the redevelopment, it's happening during construction, you know, we might have bolstered that aspect of the tree protection ordinance and really focused in on construction and redevelopment, and found out 5 years later that that wasn't really doing enough, because a lot of the loss was happening on individual residential properties, and it wasn't anything other than somebody making a decision to remove a tree. And it was death by 1,000 cuts. And so the only way that we could really think of to address that was to create a citywide tree removal permit process that would apply universally across all properties, including private properties that are not being redeveloped. We also recommended that they decrease their minimum DBH for what they had kind of defined in the ordinance as significant trees. So they had it at, I think it was 8 inches DBH. When we came into the project, we had recommended they lower it to 6. We were actually able, with our data collection, to estimate the number of trees that would be brought into kind of the under the umbrella of the tree protection ordinance by lowering it by 2 inches DBH. And it was pretty, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it was pretty significant. And so we also recommended that they create kind of that separate category for exceptional trees to protect the oldest and the largest trees. Again, trying to kind of reinforce that principle that there are some trees that deserve extra protection because the ecological services that they provide are so invaluable, and it will take, you know, decades to replace that just by replanting smaller, younger trees. We also recommended that they increase their mitigation requirements. This again kind of goes hand in hand with the jurisdictional issue, because we were expanding it, you know, kind of across the board to private properties. We had to think through a little bit kind of what that was going to look like, what mitigation was going to look like for a single family homeowner, which obviously is a little bit different than kind of in the development reconstruction or redevelopment construction process, in terms of what people can afford and what people are willing to do and all that. We recommended a scheme that really emphasized replanting as the best option. So really trying to encourage people that if you're going to remove a tree, you replant a tree in its place so that you can avoid this in lieu payment, and in trying to create a scheme where that was really incentivized. We also ended up emphasizing tree protection for construction sites in the tree protection ordinance. This was something that we got from Atlanta. They had a really robust tree protection ordinance that looked at a number of different things, including how to protect trees during the construction process. So if you kind of accidentally injured roots or something like that, what were the mitigation requirements going to be, and what were the standards for protecting during construction going to be? And then we got this from Atlanta too. We recommended increasing the flexibility of using the funds from the city's tree replacement fund. So it had previously kind of been written in that the city's tree replacement fund could kind of only be used for replanting. And we had recommended that that be made a little bit more flexible, specifically to include funding for outreach and education programs around tree planting. Again, because we did early data collection in the beginning of the project, including a resident survey, where we started to really get an understanding of how people felt about trees, kind of what the education level was about the benefits that trees provide. It became very clear that if we want people not only to curb loss on individual residential properties, but grow the urban canopy, which we also need, we needed to do a little bit of education and outreach. So it would be helpful to use that mitigation money for that purpose. We also recommended that they create a separate tree fund aside from the tree replacement fund that was able to accept charitable donations. That was a really like wonky thing I mean, that might be applicable elsewhere, but it really was having to do with the fact that there was limitations for the city being able to use quote unquote public funds and give that to private property owners. And we wanted to create a separate fund that institutional property owners like the universities and others could donate into a fund that could then be used to make grants to private property owners to plant trees. And there was just a little bit of complexity there in terms of what they could do. But that was important. The city was really interested in trying to build public-private partnerships with those types of institutional landowners who make up a pretty significant part of the city's tree canopy coverage, and incentivizing them to help fund some of these implementation efforts. And then I'll just mention that we, in addition to the changes to the tree protection ordinance, like I said, a lot of times it's accompanied by zoning changes as well. We had actually recommended that the city was looking at a change to their zoning code that would create a cool factor system. So similar to the green factor system that we see elsewhere in the country, but a little bit broader, focusing on shade generally and not just trees. And we had recommended that trees be factored into that system by creating basically a weighted scoring system that would encourage either keeping existing trees, planting new trees, or reducing impervious surfaces. So again, that's zoning. So it was really focused on new development, but we thought that complemented the tree protection ordinance changes really well. And then I'll just mention, aside from the tree protection ordinance recommendations, one of the other policy recommendations that we had for the city was that they actually create these priority planting areas. And one of the other kind of recommendations overall in terms of meeting their tree canopy coverage goal was that they would need to plant about 1,000 trees a year to really, in addition to curbing loss, to be able to meet their tree canopy coverage goals. And so we had recommended that they really concentrate those tree planting efforts annually in these priority planting areas. And the way that we identified these areas was overlaying 4 different data sets. One was what we had called populations at risk, actually in Massachusetts, align with the definition of an environmental justice population. So it's minority populations, low income populations, and non-English speaking populations. We also were able to identify the areas with heat island hotspots, so places where it's greater than 92 degrees on what would otherwise be a 90-degree day. And Kleinfelder modeled that for us using out to 2030. We also overlaid community infrastructure, so really important destinations like public schools and hospitals. And then finally, primary and secondary traffic routes. That's both driving and foot traffic. So those kind of most traveled corridors where we really want to focus on keeping people shaded. And I will stop there because I know that you all will have questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Amazing. I think there's so much to dig into there, and thank you, Deanna. That was informative, not only for the product, but I think the process here. So there's been a lot of discussion in the chat room, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of questions, and I invite people to raise their virtual hands to ask live questions here. So I'll just go down the list here. Dexter and Rachel, I think, sort of had maybe some similar questions. Dexter asked, how is loss attributed to causes? So how did you actually determine why trees were lost? And similarly, how did you get tree data? So species, size, things like that on private land.
Yeah, great questions. I will be very transparent that CLF did not do a lot of this modeling. That was Applied Ecological Services and Kleinfelder were the main sub-consultants that did a lot of that work. And I will tell you my understanding of how they did that. I know LIDAR was really the basis for a lot of the data work that they did in the context of species and condition and some of those more granular things. What I believe Applied Ecological Services ended up doing was they took the LIDAR data and they essentially trained a computer program to be able to recognize different species, I think based on reflectivity, but you'd have to ask them. But they did amazing work, basically training a computer to output all of these specifics about the tree canopy, including species. I know on condition, that was based on, again, they kind of automated a sampling where it dropped a bunch of different points across the city, and they actually went out and did field work to document the condition of the trees where the computer program had dropped the dots, and then it was extrapolated. So there's a margin of error there, but it's pretty low. So that's how we got the condition. And then in terms of how loss was attributed, a lot of that was based on construction permits. So we looked at where the canopy loss had happened, and then we dug into what were the land uses. Had the land been sold? Did it change hands? Did they have a permit for redevelopment? Digging into a lot of the city's records on like what happened on those properties during the time period where there was loss. And that's really how we determined some of the cause of loss. Obviously, again, there's a margin of error there because we can't say for sure for every single tree, but we were able to kind of generally get a sense of what was causing the loss.
One question here, was loss at all associated with densification in residential areas?
It was to a certain extent, and this was really the big question we had going in, because we had been hearing from people like, oh, there's such massive redevelopment happening, huge, new dense buildings going in, and that was what was causing a lot of the tree loss. And construction, obviously was attributed to some of the loss. But like I said, we were actually seeing that the majority of loss was on residential properties outside of the development context. So these were properties that did not get a permit for redevelopment. Most of them didn't even get permits for renovations. It was just as simple as somebody didn't want a tree. I mean, in some cases, it was because the tree was diseased or dying. In other cases, it was, we don't know. I mean, we can assume, right? People didn't want to take care of the tree anymore, wanted more light on their property. Like maybe they paved over part of their property to make a bigger driveway. We don't really know, but a lot of it was kind of individual decisions by property owners that ended up adding up across the city over a 10-year period.
Let me just get through a couple more questions and then open it up to other people to ask questions live. Any inclusion of cultural significance for heritage trees, or is a component of sort of determining the bump up to the more protection?
Yeah,
so
that's
for example, for those of you who know Boston, there's a big array of trees along Memorial Drive, right, that are sort of culturally significant, that were designed and planted by Olmsted. So things like that. Were there extra protections?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the recommendation that we had for the city on exceptional trees, we actually did not get into a lot of the specifics of how they should define that. In our conversations with the city, we decided we were going to leave that up to the arborist to determine how they were going to kind of define those exceptional trees. When we were doing our research on it, there were a number of places that did include things beyond DBH, like cultural significance. I think one of the legal challenges that we saw in a lot of the places that were designating these trees is it's a little bit different. I mean, there were some places where there, I think, was a little bit of a fear or attention about regulating these types of trees in a mandatory way. And so like there's a lot of places that have this category of trees, but the individual property owner has to like say that they want the tree to be protected, or like volunteer that the tree is going to be protected. And then the city takes like, an easement or puts a historical designation on the tree to protect it. So it's a little bit, we saw some complications there. But at the end of the day, if you're expanding the jurisdiction of the tree protection ordinance to include private properties, you mitigate some of that. But I think, you've also got to, if you're going to use the city's police power in that way, you've got to demonstrate that it's for a public good. And I think that there would be, depending on the criteria that you were using to protect a tree like that, cultural significance might be a harder one if a landowner wanted to challenge the protection designation.
There's some great link in here from Laura Roman about an example of Florida of a state level trying to interfere with with local ordinances. That seems like a great read. Thank you for sharing that. And it seems like maybe there's other efforts Pete Smith
There
was
actually
saying.
was an effort in Massachusetts a
Oh,
number of
interesting.
years ago, yeah, where the legislature was really looking to curb local protection ordinances. That seems to be a trend across the country over the past decade or so, because we have seen so many cities and towns pass protection ordinances, and many of them have applied to private property. It's really going back to that tension I mentioned earlier, where a lot of people feel that this is an infringement on their private property rights. And you know, there have been legal challenges to tree protection ordinances, and yeah, a lot of legislatures have responded by trying to curb the ability of cities and towns to pass this type of ordinance.
Just a couple more questions here. People are really curious if they could get a copy. You had mentioned the survey you had done with the private residents or of Cambridge, if there's a copy of the survey or any recommendations from the report itself that you could share out. And just so people know, there's two documents that came out of the UFP in Cambridge. One was a very engaging, 100 or 200 page report,
yeah,
followed by a 700 page technical report, if I'm not mistaken. So
the nice thing about that project page, though, is if you go to the City of Cambridge's Urban Forest Master Plan webpage, everything that we ever produced is there. If you go into documents, you can see the survey results. You can see our meetings with the Urban Forest Master Planning Task Force. And we reported at every stage of the planning process and the data collection process, what we were seeing, what we were doing, what we were finding, and all of that is documented on that webpage. So even if you don't want to dig into the 700 page technical report and you're interested in one piece of it, you can pretty much find anything that you're looking for on that webpage.
Great. And I just dropped that link in the chat window for folks to look at. And then final question, and then I'll turn it over. Well, actually, two interesting questions here. Did you find any examples of funds being made available to improve the quality of maintenance, not planting, but maintenance done for private trees?
Yeah, yep. And you can definitely do that. It's just a matter of how you phrase it in the ordinance. I don't quote me on this, but Atlanta might have that flexibility. They had we kept coming back to their tree protection ordinance. It's older, but it's really robust. It's like, it's really long. Most tree protection ordinances you see are like 5 or 10 pages. Theirs is like 30. And it creates a number of different mechanisms. So it's focused on tree removal, but it also has a huge section about everything that you can do with the tree replacement fund. It also creates a separate council within the city that oversees a lot of this in addition to city staff. So Atlanta would be a good one to look at if you're interested in maintenance requirements. But yeah, there's really no issue in creating the flexibility for those types of uses. It's just a matter of writing it into the ordinance. And obviously there's a competition for those funds because you want to use them for other things too.
And then a question here, the political process of getting the ordinance actually passed. What was that like?
So Cambridge was interesting. So when we started working on the project, there was generally a recognition in the city that something needed to be done about trees. There was like a lot of urgency around the declining canopy. And that's obviously, why the Department of Public Works got the funding to do this project. But at the time that we actually were like hired to work on the project, the city council was moving full speed ahead with changes. And what ended up happening is, I think through a number of different ways, we kind of ended up effectively advocating that like real long-term permanent changes to the ordinance should wait until we're done with the planning process. That was difficult to get people to want to wait because there was, again, a lot of urgency, I think, being felt around this. And so what they ended up doing was passing a short-term moratorium on tree removal that was in effect during the time that we were doing the UFMP. And then when the UFMP was coming to an end, we had conversations with city staff, city council members about what we were recommending. The tricky part about, this kind of situation is the city doesn't control the tree protection ordinance, the city council does. So if there's going to be changes made to the tree protection ordinance, those have to come from city council. We weren't working for city council. We were working for the Department of Public Works. So they did end up moving forward with amended language. But again, like we made our recommendations. They took some of them, others they didn't. I can't remember exactly what made it into the final version, but it's tricky because, there was tension, I think, between the city running the process and then the city council feeling a lot of urgency to do something quickly, and maybe not wanting to kind of wait for all of the data or information to come out before they did that.
How long, just so people have a sense, how much did this whole UFP process cost and how long did it take?
Oof. I don't remember the total cost. It was a couple $100,000. And it took, I want to say, either 2 or 2.5 years. It was longer than we had anticipated. I think we thought it could be a 1.5-year-ish project. And I think it was either 2, maybe just over 2 years. It took us to really wrap everything up.
And I know there's continuing actually to take those recommendations. I believe that Regent Hildebrand is still involved in the outreach and education component of it. So
yeah, and I'll mention too,
yeah.
one of the other things that we, when we were really giving the city our recommendations, it became really clear that a lot of the things that we wanted them to do, especially because there was 2 issues, right? We needed to curb loss, but we also needed to accelerate the replanting rate if we were going to reach the tree canopy coverage goals and remain there out into 2030, 2050. For the replanting, it became really clear that the city didn't have the capacity really to do the type of education and outreach and stewardship that needed to be done with residents and on private property to really achieve what they needed to achieve. And so one of our recommendations was to try and help facilitate or steward some type of dedicated nonprofit or other group whose mission was this. And we've found in kind of research in other places that tends to be important because there's only so much the city can do, and to have a separate non-governmental group really stewarding this and really focused on this is honestly a game changer.
Well, I tried to capture as much as I could from the chat. If I didn't get to your question, I apologize. Happy to just open the floor for folks to ask questions. We have about 8 minutes left here. Either raise your hand or just unmute yourself.
Hey guys, I was curious. A lot of times where I'm from, when they get rid of a tree on their property, like a big oak or something, what they end up doing, what they're happy to do is, in best case scenario, plant a red bud or a flowering dogwood, often a crepe myrtle, but they consider that like some sort of reasonable replacement. It's usually they're scared of a tree falling on their house, and then they want a small decorative tree, which obviously isn't anything close to equivalent. You didn't specify what kind of trees they're replanting, so I definitely want to hear more on that.
Yeah, so we did, and again, this was really Applied Ecological Services, but we determined a species list based on the susceptibility of different species to diseases and pests that we're seeing now or expecting to see, over the next few decades, as well as tolerance to flood and drought. And there's a list that was created for the city to recommend specific species, also to diversify the canopy coverage, because like I said, 33% of the canopy was 3 different species, which isn't ideal. And so we provided them with a list. The idea would be, and again, what ends up making it into the ordinance and what was in our recommendations might be 2 different things, but the idea was if you create a tree permit process and somebody has to come into the city to get a permit to remove their tree, and their mitigation is going to be to replant rather than an in lieu payment, you would be giving them instruction on what types of trees they can replant, essentially. In terms of enforcement, I don't know if that's like really been tested. Like if a homeowner came in and they were like, I'm removing this tree, I'll replant one, but I'm not replanting the one that you're suggesting, what that would look like in terms of enforcement and if that would really be enforceable. But I think, if you want to take a softer approach, I think it's definitely, if you've got that list and you can explain to people why you're recommending certain species over others, or why certain species are more beneficial than others, you might get more compliance that way. I'm not sure, but I think it is important to have an idea of what types of species you're aiming for, both in kind of the percentage of the canopy, but also in thinking about, because we've got a lot of native species that aren't going to do well in 2030, 2050 because of their low drought or flood tolerance. So it's really a shift from what we've always done in trying to educate people about why we need to plant new and different types of species.
Other comments or questions? I'm not monitoring the chat room anymore, so, but there's some good stuff going on in there too, Deanna.
I'm not sure if I missed the answer to this question, but all the research that you did to put all of this stuff together, who funded that initiative?
It was all part of the UFMP, so it was all funded by Cambridge.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was
Did I
really
see-
the majority of CLF scope of work. I mean, I mentioned our consulting team had like 5 or 6 different consultants. The lead consultant was a landscape architecture firm based in Cambridge. We had Applied Ecological Services, we had Kleinfelder, we had a number of different consultants with different scopes. And part of the value of having CLF on the team was to do a lot of that policy and legal research.
Deanna, this is awesome. Thank you so much for all this research and sharing it with us. We in Philly, we're just in the draft stage of our strategic plan, the Philly Tree Plan, and so this is extremely timely. In looking at all these documents on the page, the Urban Forest Master Plan page, can you direct us to which one would be the most relevant to this conversation? Because there are quite a few of them.
Yeah. So I think David mentioned this. There's like a summary report that's called, I think it's called Healthy Urban Forests. That now available to view. That's like the high level executive summary, and that'll give you like the top line findings on everything. And that's like a quick thing to view. There's in the documents, there's a more detailed technical report, which is like 700 pages. The technical report appendix, I think, is the big one.
There's a policy options handout. Would that one be good?
Yeah, that would be good. That was something that we developed early on. It doesn't exactly match up with our final recommendations, but actually, if you want to click on that one, David, what we did there is again, like I mentioned, we were trying to weigh the pros and cons of different interventions. And so this was really like, we named something that we thought they should do, and we talked about why we thought they should do it, and then we talked about the pros and cons of doing it. So this one did make it into the final recommendation, the redefining, a lot of these did actually, redefining significant trees, the exceptional tree category. Some of these didn't, enhancing the role of the committee on planting. But this was kind of the universe of things we considered, and then this got narrowed down to the final recommendations. But you'll see in the analysis portion of the options why we were recommending what we were recommending, which again, like I feel like I can't emphasize this enough. The data collection was so critical in guiding what we recommended for solutions. Like I've seen a lot where there's an urgency to do something, and like a city will like copy and paste a tree ordinance from another city. And that is not the way to do things sustainably, because you have no idea whether or not their problems are your problems. And so we really wanted to take the time to describe why we thought this was a solution based on what we had found in the data, and then also talk about the trade-offs, because I think it would be unrealistic to suggest that all of these are easy or aren't going to have unintended consequences, because they do. And so there's got to be an informed decision about, whether or not you're willing to make that trade-off.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of documents in there. I find the naming of those documents hard to follow. I wish Cambridge had done it a little differently, but I think this is the final report. It's called the technical report. And that's a couple of 100 pages. That's maybe 100 and 200 pages, something like that.
Yeah.
And then the appendix is the one where you can really dig in, and that's 600
That's
or
all the
700
data.
pages.
Yeah. And the appendix should
Brookline
have the survey results too.
So again, that's in the link. I'll drop it in the chat window. I'll drop it in one more time, and in our follow-up notes, I'll be sure to include that. I know Brookline just came out with a report. I think Somerville, I'm just thinking locally here, just came out with their urban forest report or plan. You know, I see Philadelphia's, you know, I know about Philadelphia's, Boston is doing one too right now. There's a lot that's happened since Cambridge finished their report, and I think we're learning a lot from other cities and how they're doing it differently. I wanted to acknowledge that it is 11. I will, you know, Deanna, do you want to drop your email in the chat window so
Sure.
people have it?
Yep.
And I'll post this in the coming days on YouTube with some follow-up notes. Appreciate everyone coming. I will also analyze the survey data and hopefully see some of you in a couple of weeks out in either virtually or in person out in Louisville. And we are still actually trying to figure out what we're going to do for December. We don't have a speaker lined up. We might just have a social hour type of thing. And if you are interested in presenting anytime in 2022, please reach out. We have a totally open calendar for third Wednesdays of the month as part of the Urban Ecology Collaborative. So big round of applause. Thank you, Deanna, for joining us and for sharing and for doing that work and then being able to share it so cogently and powerfully. So a model for us all.
Thanks, everyone.
David, in terms of
Yeah.
UEC meetup at PCF, I want to see people, so let me
Right,
know.
TTYL. All right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, either way, we'll see each other, but it would be fun to have a formal gathering.
Yeah, do you know
Yeah,
how many people did the poll?
I think we had 30 or 40 people do the poll, but I haven't yet. Yeah, I'll share that with you, Erica, if you're interested in the quick
Cool.
summary.
Yeah, just want to see people in person. Yay!
Happy Halloween, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you, Deanna.